If I asked you what setting you wanted the next historical Total War game to be set in, what would you say? My guess is Medieval 3, or maybe Empire 2. Some of you might even say the Victorian era, or Rome 3. And to be clear, I'd be happy with any of those. But if you asked me the same question, my answer would be World War I. I've thought that World War I was inevitable ever since 2012 when Fall of the Samurai came out and absolutely blew me away with how much it improved on the gunpowder warfare formula laid down by Empire Total War a few years prior. In this video, we're going to talk about the First World War, what it was and why it would make for such a revolutionary Total War game that could match, if not surpass, what fantasy Total War brings to the table in ways that other historical eras simply could not. So if that sounds good to you, then a like on the video is the best way to support the channel against the YouTube algorithm. So let's begin with a little history. The year was 1914. In the deafening silence that followed the Napoleonic Wars that racked the continent a century prior, Europe had forgotten. The delicate balance of power tenuously held by the so-called Concert of Europe was about to come tumbling down with catastrophic results. Armed to the teeth with the dark excesses of the Industrial Revolution and fueled by a lethal combination of militarism, imperialism, nationalism, and a complicated web of alliances, Europe was a powder keg ready to explode. In fact, it was a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, who lit the fuse in June 1914 by killing the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. The diplomatic situation swiftly deteriorated, and by the beginning of August, England, France, and Russia formed the Allies, or Triple Entente, and Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire formed the Central Powers. Europe was at war once more. Europe was no stranger to large-scale conflict, as any Total War player knows, but this abomination known as the Great War was something entirely different. It wouldn't be long after it began before the soldiers who marched off to fight were subjected to horrors unlike anything anyone could have imagined. Machine guns, poison gas, and the explicit targeting of civilian populations. This was industrial-scale slaughter. The British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on a single day during the Battle of the Somme, the deadliest day in British military history. Throughout the war, technology and tactics evolved significantly as pre-war military doctrine proved woefully inadequate, if not suicidal, in the face of the grinding trench warfare ubiquitous on the Western Front. Tanks, submachine guns, and aerial combat would all make their debuts throughout the war. Italy joined the Allies in 1915, and the United States followed suit in 1917, tipping the scales in the Allies' favor. The war ended in November of the following year, and it was a dismal affair for all sides. During the Battle of Verdun, the French and Germans combined suffered approximately 700,000 casualties. The United States fought the bloodiest battle in its history, bringing the war to a close during the Meuse-Argonne offensive at the cost of 122,000 casualties. 4 of the major empires involved disintegrated completely, and one of them wasn't even on the losing side. The war, which had been long desired by members of the Austro-Hungarian leadership, with the notable exception of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, resulted in the collapse of the empire. The German, Ottoman, and Russian empires would also be destroyed. In total, 20 million souls perished in World War I. So before we get into the nitty-gritty details of how a World War I Total War would work, I want to explain why this setting has so much potential. Look, fundamentally, Warhammer Fantasy is a medieval fantasy setting. It's basically just a wackier version of Tolkien's setting for The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, which is why it's so funny to me that Games Workshop is so cringe and defensive about their IP. Like, come on, man, let's be honest. Your IP is a pretty blatant ripoff of other IPs, with a couple unique elements like the Skaven thrown in, so just give me a break with the Nintendo-level crackdowns on fan content. Anyways, Total War Medieval 3 will need to compete with this setting that simply offers more tactical options, and no amount of pike wall or shield walls will close the gap that magic, flight, and single-entity super units bring to the table. Much like the criticisms that Records Mode received in Three Kingdoms, to some people, Medieval 3 will be seen simply as Warhammer, but with all the fun taken out. Now that's a totally unfair and untrue critique. It's untrue for people like me, who greatly appreciate the political intrigue and geopolitical depth that a campaign set in the Middle Ages involves. But I think it's fair to say, and of course feel free to disagree, that for your average player who didn't grow up a giga nerd looking at medieval encyclopedia books, Warhammer has more immediate appeal. I've seen this myself firsthand when introducing friends to the Total War series. Shogun 2 was what I always first recommended to them, and it didn't stick. But Warhammer 2 did. In my view, World War I circumvents the Medieval 3 problem. Yes, it is still a historical setting, but it doesn't have a fantasy analog within the same series to directly compete with. The same things that made World War I hell on earth for the soldiers in our own timeline are the things that would make a World War I Total War so exciting to play. No game has done what this game would do, and certainly not on the scale that it would do it. So what would a Total War World War I look and actually play like? Believe it or not, most of the groundwork necessary for this game is already there. Let's start with the campaign map. It needs to be massive. It's right there in the name, World War. Luckily, the groundwork for such a massive map is already there. Empire Total War ambitiously featured 3 theaters and 5 continents. Something on that scale, but with the detail of Warhammer's Mortal Empires map, would work perfectly for this. The campaign could begin in 1905 with 12 turns per year. This would allow lots of flexibility for building alliances, conducting smaller wars, and land grabbing before the big one kicks off later on. Speaking of alliances, Three Kingdoms' diplomacy system absolutely must be in this game in order for it to work. World War I is famous for 3 things, among others: poison gas, trench warfare, and complicated alliances. Troy's resource system needs to be in this game as well. World War I featured blockades and unrestricted submarine warfare in order to cut off essential war materials and to unintentionally drag other countries into the war. Internal political problems are another must-have, a massive staple of the era. Empire Total War featured social classes, patriotic fervor, war weariness, cabinets, elections, revolutions, and government changes. We absolutely cannot have the bare-bones systems present in Warhammer and Troy. Screwing up the implementation of internal politics or diplomacy in this game would seriously hurt it. The supply system from Three Kingdoms ought to make a return as well. The Germans made stunning gains in their 1918 spring offensive, but they were unable to hold those gains because they outpaced their supply lines. Naval battles absolutely must return as well. After all, the war featured the largest naval engagement in history at the Battle of Jutland. And just like with Fall of the Samurai, having battleships nearby when a land battle is taking place should make off-map artillery bombardments available to whoever's ships they are. Speaking of land battles, this is the area where I'm sure people are most skeptical that a World War I Total War could even work. And no doubt, it is the area that needs the most innovation and attention from CA. That being said, we've had crude, constructible trenches, garrisonable buildings, and a basic cover system ever since Empire Total War, although these systems need to be greatly expanded upon and made less clunky. The area that needs the most attention, in my view, is the infantry combat. Individual soldiers need to have rudimentary AI, like the individual models themselves, and quadruple the animations that they currently have. Basically, they need to act more independently, crouching, laying prone, and seeking nearby cover when under artillery or machine gun fire, all without being told to by the player. Selling the fantasy of infantry behavior is the #1 thing that would make or break the combat in this game, and it's a thing that large-scale real-time tactics games have, in my opinion, failed to do time and time again. The infantry always seem to get shafted in these large-scale games, like Ruse and World in Conflict. The only game that gets infantry combat right without being hyper-realistic is Company of Heroes 1, not 2. In Company of Heroes 1, individual models dynamically sought nearby cover and dove out of the way of grenades and explosions. It was, and unfortunately still is, revolutionary. Relic, being the disappointment that they've been for a decade, took it out of Company of Heroes 2 because it didn't always work right. Sometimes infantry would dive out of rather than into cover. But Company of Heroes is a small-scale, intensely competitive RTS game, a different beast entirely from Total War. The system that Company of Heroes 1 had is exactly what I imagine the system World War I Total War would have. Even if it isn't perfect, it doesn't need to be. But what we absolutely cannot have is soldiers standing still, shooting across the battlefield at each other like it's still the 18th century. Total War has always had an infantry focus, and this game's success, for me, would rest on the feel and responsiveness of the infantry combat. I'm not worried about the maps, because Troy's battle maps are so much better than anything that's come before it, and all you need to do is bring that level of quality into this game for it to work perfectly. I'm also not worried about the game's atmosphere, despite how important it is to me, because more often than not, CA absolutely nails the atmosphere in their games. Medieval 1, Attila, Shogun 2, and Napoleon are incredibly engrossing, atmospheric games that practically forced me to learn more about the time periods that they're set in. The thundering artillery and distant roar of Gatling guns in Fall of the Samurai is just a masterclass in sound design. This is something that Battlefield 1, a World War I themed shooter, blew me away with. The gameplay for Battlefield 1 is anything but historically accurate, but the atmosphere in that game is an absolute experience. I'm probably out of step with some of you on this, but historical accuracy doesn't matter to me nearly as much as the combination of world building, atmosphere, and above all, fun gameplay. And Battlefield 1 delivers this in spades. It oozes love, reverence, and respect for the First World War from the moment you first launch the tutorial, to the operations cutscenes narrating the history behind the battle you're about to fight, to the iconic trench whistle followed by the screaming of the soldiers when you capture a sector, to the meticulously recreated janky weapons, the mud everywhere, the poison gas grenades and gas masks, the zeppelins and biplanes, rudimentary tanks. BF1 is a masterpiece in my eyes, and the atmosphere is one of the main reasons for that. Atmosphere is one of those elements that pulls you in just one more layer away from the fact that you're interacting with pixels, tables, and thousands of lines of code. And I have confidence that CA would portray World War I as the hellish, apocalyptic tragedy that it really was. I hope that throughout the video, the gravity of the actual war has shown through. Reading the love letters, journal entries, and poems of the soldiers, doctors, and nurses who had first-hand experience with the conflict is truly harrowing stuff. A Total War game set in that era would inspire people to learn more about it, and those who fought in it, much like Battlefield 1 did years ago, which to me is a great thing. If you want to learn more about World War I yourself, I highly recommend checking out the Great War channel here on YouTube. Absolutely fantastic stuff that covers every single week of the war in chronological order, from beginning to end. Unfortunately, I don't think World War I will be the next mainline historical title. I think Medieval 3 and Empire 2 or Victoria era are the most likely candidates. And again, I'm happy with those. I've been waiting for CA to tackle the First World War ever since Fall of the Samurai blew me away, and I'll continue to wait until they hopefully finally do. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more Total War content just like this. Let me know down below what you want the next Total War setting to be. Doesn't matter if it's fantasy or historical, and whether or not you'd be excited for a World War I Total War. Take care everybody, and I will see you in the next video.